greatness that we have within our midst. If we don't waste it, it's about making sure we don't waste it. We have a lot of very important people. Virtually everybody here is an important person in our audience, but I'd like to introduce Dean White from the Law School of the University of Miami. And a young lady who I knew when she was born, who is now the chief judge of Dade County, Judge Soto. And why she has a special place in my heart because of her father. Her father, Osvaldo Soto, was and is one of the legendary lawyers that came out of Cuba. And when I was a young lawyer, President Padron mentioned a little bit about this. My father's American, so I didn't have an accent. Matter of fact, I probably talk like a gringo. But the fact is, I was in court with a friend of mine who had a very heavy accent. And in front of me, the judge said, "Come back when you can speak English," quote, unquote. And Osvaldo Soto, along with several other Cuban-American lawyers, started the Cuban-American Bar Association that started as 14 lawyers and today is thousands of lawyers. It's interesting because no judge would ever miss an installation of the Cuban-American Bar Association, yet think what that judge thought or said what that judge said. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. And I'm not going to take up any more time because we've got a fabulous first panel that Professor Moran is going to chair.
Well, I wanted to thank both Steve Zack and Dr. Padron for those wonderful, inspiring, welcoming remarks. I also just wanted to thank Steve Zack and Luis Suarez at Boies Schiller for all the work that they did to make this happen. Steve came to us when we announced this project and said it would be great to do something here in Miami, but he didn't just say it would be great, he actually made it happen. And that's the special next step that's always required. And before we get going, I just wanted to thank a few other people who have been very important to the success of this event, including at Boies Schiller, Michelle, Anna, and Carlos, and then at Miami-Dade College, the wonderful team led by Isabel, and then with Patricia, Amanda, and A.T., and then our own American Bar Foundation's Matilda Stubbs, because this never happens without a huge amount of work behind the scenes. Now, it's my great privilege to chair the opening session on Hispanics and the making of Miami. You just heard about the remarkable transformation that the city has undergone because of immigration. Now you're going to hear about the ongoing dynamic transformation that's happening as we speak. And I thought it was extremely inspiring, but I hope you will also think imaginatively about the future as you hear these remarks, because this is an opportunity for all of the talent in this room to work with us to think about the direction of this project. So we really do want to hear from you. Now, I wanted to just introduce our two panelists now, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they speak. So our first speaker is going to be Alejandro Portes, who is professor of law and distinguished scholar of arts and sciences at the University of Miami, as well as the Howard Harrison and Gabriel Snyder Beck Professor of Sociology Emeritus at Princeton University. And he's going to be talking about diversity and inequality in the global city. I think we had a nice lead-in from Dr. Padron's remarks about the ongoing importance of inequality as well as race and ethnicity, both in the country and here in Miami. Dr. Portes has been published widely, so I'm only going to be able to give you a small sampling of his work. We also provided you with a bibliography if you want to read more. So he is the author of 250 articles and chapters on national development, international migration, Latin American and Caribbean urbanization, and economic sociology, which is why I can't read all of his publications to you. But his books include City on the Edge, The Transformation of Miami, which was published in 1993 and co-authored with Alex Stepek and won the Robert Park Award for Best Book in Urban Sociology and the Anthony Leeds Award for Best Book in Urban Anthropology. He has also written Immigrant America, a Portrait, published in 2006. It's the third edition, which was designated as a centennial publication by the University of California Press. Now, his current research is on the adaptation process of the immigrant second generation in a comparative perspective, and he published with Ruben Rumbaugh Legacies, the story of the immigrant second generation, and as well as ethnicities, children of immigrants in America. And Legacies won the 2002 Distinguished Scholarship Award from the American Sociological Association and the 2002 W.I. Thomas and Florence Naniecki Award for Best Book from the International Migration section of the American Sociological Association. He also has numerous awards that I won't repeat at length, but I think you get a sense of the important scholarship he's doing, and he's going to present for us brand new work that he's doing on the transition here in Miami. And then we're going to hear from Professor Grenier, who's going to also talk about the Cuban-American transition, demographic and ideological change in the Cuban-American population of Miami. He is the professor in sociology at Florida International University and also is widely published. His first book was called Inhuman Relations, and it was a study of the interplay of culture, institutions, and ideology in a particular workplace. And then he has taken those themes and they have threaded through his entire body of work, including his work on Miami. He has two books that I want to mention, Miami Now, Immigration, Ethnicity, and Social Change with Alex Stepek, and he's also written on Cuban Americans, Legacy of Exile, Cubans in the United States with Lisandro Perez. And I think that he is also working on a co-authored piece called This Land is Our Land.
That's done.
That's done. Okay, he's very fast and prolific. And what he's going to do for us today is help us to understand how these demographic changes are altering the ideological dispositions of the community here in Miami with a new polling data. So his is also brand new from a poll that is run out of Florida International University. So we're very fortunate to get hot off the press. You're hearing it here first. Thank you. They'll see them here and they'll see them there.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to have and thank you, Rachel, for that great introduction. And it's a significant honor to have both Steve Zack and Eduardo Padron, an old friend, to open this event, as Steve himself called. He certainly had been one of the pillars of the community and a key element of the story of what Miami is now, a global city. I am also an old Miamian, and I came before you. So I came at least almost a year before the two of you, so I can claim that honor for whatever it is, as well as you did in that introduction. Well, without further ado, let me use my time to convey some information that might be new, might be familiar to some, new to others, but I thought that was my mission as a sociologist to do here. The population classifies as Hispanic in the Miami metropolitan area represents now about 2/3 of the total of this area, having grown steadily over the years. It now represents the mainstream of this metro area, since the component classified as native white, or Anglo as used to be called, has declined rapidly and now represents less than 15% of the total. The Afro-American population of the county has held steady at about 20%. But the Hispanic population of this country, of this area, this is the Miami metropolitan area, these different municipalities, There are 36 of them, and that is divided, that you don't need to remember the names of them, but what you may need to remember is this map. The map, the sections in yellow are the areas that are predominantly Hispanic in the Miami-Dade metropolitan area. And as you can see, they are huge. The ones in green are the predominantly African-American areas of the city. The ones in yellow are the predominantly Hispanic, and the ones in white are the ones that remain as that are Anglo-white or native white, and as you can see, they represent a very shrinking component demographically of this population. But the Hispanic population of Miami is quite different from that of other metropolitan areas in this country, in that it is simultaneously part of the economic and political elite of Miami-Dade County, and it is also a major component of its working class. It plays a dual role in that form. This paradox is explained by two facts. First, the heterogeneity of the so-called Hispanic population. This is just a label. And second, the unique position of Miami in relation to the Latin American countries to its south. Under this label of Hispanic, you find people of multiple nationalities, races, socioeconomic classes, and political origins. The social pages of the Miami newspapers are full of Latin names and Latin faces, an integral part of the local elite, while it is also migrants, mostly undocumented, who pick up the fruit and winter vegetable crops in the rural southern quadrant of the county for export to the rest of the nation. Most of the Hispanic population of the country as a whole is composed of working-class immigrants and their descendants who came here in quest of a better economic situation for themselves and their families. The vast Mexican origin population, the largest among all Latin American groups, is mostly of that class, of that origin. Miami is quite different. A large proportion of South Florida-bound migration has been composed primarily of refugees escaping political oppression at home. That situation has been brought about by populist revolutions or coups in the home countries that targeted the upper and middle classes for persecution and that expelled many of them. These educated, skilled, and formerly well-to-do persons did not disperse all over the world, nor went to multiple cities in the United States. Instead, they concentrated here at the tip of South Florida. For reasons of geography and history, Miami has been historically linked to the Caribbean and Latin America since its very foundation. Before the Cuban upper and middle classes arrived here as penniless refugees, they had for decades actually spent their vacations in Miami Beach and shop in the stores at Lincoln Road. Havana was so close to Miami that in the 1950s, it was not uncommon for the well-to-do in the island to grab a plane in the morning, spend the day shopping or sightseeing in Miami, and return to Havana in the evening. At a greater distance, wealthy Venezuelans and Nicaraguans did about the same. So, Miami has been the place of refuge for the losing side in the populist revolutions throughout Latin America who came here to regroup, to reorganize, and often to try to reconquer their lost nations. Sometimes they succeeded, as at least partially in the case of Nicaraguans. Other times they failed, as in the case of Cubans during the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and the following US-Soviet accord that ended the missile crisis in 1962. When that happened, former elites have had to transform what was a permanent sojourn, a temporary stay, almost an extended vacation, into permanent settlement. However, these groups possess the necessary skills and the necessary social cohesiveness to avoid being relegated to the bottom of the American ethnic class hierarchy, as is routinely the case for manual labor migrants and their children. Instead, they first concentrated in creating and growing their own economic enterprises and eventually transformed their newly acquired economic wealth into considerable political power. The current U.S. Senator from Florida, Mr. Marco Rubio, is a product of that process. But arguably, no one represents it better than Jose Oliva, who was the founder and owner of a cigar-making enterprise, actually a cigar-making enterprise, that's appropriate for a Cuban entrepreneur, and is now the newly elected Speaker of the Florida legislature in Tallahassee. The Miami-Dade metropolitan population is classified today as 79% white, 19% black, and 3% Asian or other. The white population is, however, largely Hispanic, because native whites comprise only 15% of the total. In the interest of time, I will concentrate my remarks exclusively on the Hispanic population, since this is the purpose of our being here. Miami Hispanic population is not uniform either. It's not homogeneous. And I think of it as a sort of a mosaic, as a it could be represented as sort of a six-pointed star, as it is there, with Cubans, Colombians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans occupied each one of the points, the rest being composed of Mexicans, Central American and Caribbeans, and other South American nationalities. I'm going to describe, to the extent that I can, and Rachel is going to time me, each of these groups as far as we can go, as a way of highlighting the very diversity of the Hispanic population that lives in this city. So let me start, obviously, with the Cubans. Miami today would be incomprehensible without the Cuban Revolution. That historical event expelled the entire upper and middle class of pre-revolutionary Cuba, and as we have just seen, their attempts to defeat the Castro regime failed repeatedly and confined them to permanent exile here in South Florida. With support from generous support from the U.S. federal government, the Cubans proceeded to build a vibrant economic enclave that by 1967 already numbered close to 1,000 firms. 10 years later, the U.S. Census counted over 30,000 Cuban-owned enterprises in the United States, most of them concentrated in the Miami metro area, over 30,000. Many were single-person enterprises, but they also included half of the largest Hispanic-owned firms in the nation and the largest bank. At that time, there was one firm per every 27 Cuban-born persons in the country. Cubans then proceeded to translate these economic resources into political power, especially when the old Southern-style Anglo leadership of Miami attempted to reassert its hegemony by confining exiles to a subordinate position in the local ethnic queue. Cubans at the time, this in the 70s, responded by naturalizing in record numbers, voting massively, and employing the wealth accumulated by their businesses in numerous political campaigns. In a few years, Anglo hegemony here was a thing of the past. The so-called known group, a tiny conclave of Anglo executives led by the then editor of the Miami Herald, who had called the shots in the city for many years, ceased to exist. The newspaper itself appointed a new editor of Cuban and Puerto Rican origin, and then the parent company promptly left the city. So this, that's not reader. So by the end of the 20th centuries, the mayors of the city of Miami, of Miami-Dade County, and of most of its main municipalities were Cuban or Cuban-American, as were 2/3 of the state legislatures and 2 federal congresspersons. The advent of a new century added another congressman and 2 U.S. senators, first Mel Martinez and then Marco Rubio, who then as we know in 2016, saw fit to run for U.S. president. These developments go a long way to explain the peculiarity of Miami as an American city. It is not only immigrant-populated, but immigrant-ruled. In areas of Latin concentration, it is scarcely worthwhile to run for public office if one is not Cuban or Cuban-American at this point. In Miami, Spanish is at par with English as a language of business and public discourse. It is not exclusively the language of the maids or of the construction workers, but also that of business owners and managers and owners of multinational corporations. Multilingualism and multiculturalism are at the core of the city's economic success. This is what turned Miami into a global city. And by 2015, to conclude, the Cuban origin population of the metropolitan area numbered almost 1,928,000, which represent 35% of the total. On to other groups, Colombians. Nothing as dramatic as the Cuban Revolution preceded mass migration from Colombia to South Florida. It was instead driven by political instability and civil war at home, plus the pervasive influence of the drug trade. Close proximity to the north coast of Colombia turned Miami for a time into the capital of the cocaine trade back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, both as a reception point for drug shipments from northern Colombia and as a center for money laundering. During a good part of the 1980s, Miami's financial machine, as an author of another book mentioned, Miami's financial machine kicked on cocaine. And that was true. During a good part of the 1980s, with Colombian drug lords ruled the trade and their cocaine cowboys ruled the streets. The intervention of a federal task force led by then Vice President George Bush, plus a concerted effort by the FBI and local law enforcement was necessary to bring this situation under control. By and large, the Florida route was abandoned by the cocaine groups in favorable of the more hospitable confines of unguarded lands in Central America and the border with Mexico. Most Colombians came and settled in South Florida as legal immigrants. Many came from urban areas and were actually better educated than the average immigrant from Latin America nationwide. By 2015, we had almost 124,000 Colombians living in Miami, representing almost 5% of the population. Despite their numbers, the Colombian political presence here is rather limited, and that can be explained by two factors. First, the association with the drug trade did taint the community. While the vast majority of Colombians are legitimate, hardworking immigrants, they still live and work under a pall of suspicion. As several Colombian American scholars have noted, this generalized suspicion does not come exclusively from the outside world, but from the Colombian community itself. Mutual suspicion generates lack of trust, and this in turn makes it hard to create and sustain a strong ethnic organization projecting a strong political presence. While many charitable and civic Colombian associations do exist, their presence have not translated into political power. Few Colombian or Colombian American candidates have been elected to public office in South Florida, and those who succeeded did so mostly by allying themselves with Cuban American politicians and tapping into the Cuban electorate. Especially the Colombian immigrant population is dispersed throughout the metropolitan area, living in Coral Gables, Kendall, and other middle-class areas, as well as in working-class Hialeah and other low-income areas of the city. Lack of a strong social and political presence is also due to a second characteristic of Colombian immigration, namely its lack of finality. Unlike the earlier waves of Cuban exiles who could not or would not go back home, Colombian immigrants can easily return home. Bogota is only a short 2-hour hop from Miami by air, and since Colombia is a democratic country, its citizens can move back and forth unhindered across national borders. Colombians in Miami travel back home frequently, make investments there, own property, and participate in national festivities and politics. They often pay greater attention to Colombian elections and soccer matches than to those in their adopted city. That lack of a definite commitment to their American settling place weakens in turn the political voice. Unlike the Cubans who had to make a long-term choice for their adopted city by dint of their historical circumstances, Colombians can always go back and often lead transnational lives between their places of origins and Miami. How are we doing on time? Okay. Well, then I can go to the next group. I don't think that I can cover all of them, but I'll try to to tell you briefly a story, and I would preface by saying, I'm trying to tell it like it is. That is from the point of view of a social scientist, not necessarily from the point of view of a political advocate or a political candidate. So basically, I think that this is for information that it's there. Some people may not entirely agree, but I like to provide the sort of the facts that underlie the characteristics of the different populations that share this city. Well, Nicaraguans are very interesting. The advent of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua triggered an exodus of the upper and middle classes towards South Florida that resembled very much the earlier Cuban flow. It certainly at that time, in the 80s, it would appear that there would be a repeat performance here, and complete with the emergence of a little Managua somewhere, and the rise of a second powerful Latin group in local politics. It did not happen that way, and the reasons why not are instructive. Unlike the reception accorded to earlier Cuban exiles, the Reagan administration in the 1980s was much less inclined to welcome Nicaraguan refugees to South Florida. It preferred to keep the anti-Sandinista discontent bottled up in Nicaragua and encourage men of fighting age to join the Contra Army that was being organized in Honduras. Many Nicaraguans seeking to escape their country and make it to American shores were actually summarily deported. Under these circumstances, the only firm ally of the would-be refugees from Nicaragua was by then now well-established Cuban community here. Seeing the Nicaraguans as their allies in their own struggle against the Castro regime and as brothers in arms in the anti-communist crusade, the Cuban establishment of Miami closed ranks in defense of the newcomers, from the then city manager Cesar Odio to the city manager, to the county manager, to others, in a sense, opposing the federal government. So you had an interesting situation with the very same people that the federal government was trying to deport were being protected and given support and resettlement aid by the local government here in Miami. So that stance gave rise to a singular situation in which the same people who the federal government was trying to expel from the country were welcomed and protected by the local government here. In the end, the South Florida congressional delegation, comprised largely of Cuban Americans, succeeded in obtaining temporary protected status for the Nicaraguans. The relevant bill, known by its acronym, the NACARA bill, was actually written by a Cuban American congressman, Lincoln Diaz Balart. The stage was then set for a Nicaraguan enclave, a little Managua akin to Little Havana, and indeed Nicaraguan businesses and organizations of all kinds proliferated during the 1980s. However, a new turn of events stopped the development of this community on its tracks. As it happened, the Contra War was successful, forcing the Sandinista regime to call national elections that it lost. The advent of a new democratic government under President Violeta Chamorro opened the door for a massive return of Nicaraguans back to their country. The US federal government actually encouraged that return flow, as did the new Chamorro administration in Managua that offered a number of positions to prominent Nicaraguans who had been exiled here. Air traffic from Miami International Airport to Managua expanded rapidly, as did trade between the two cities. So seeing no reason to continue assisting the former refugees, Cuban exile organizations withdrew their support. Thereafter, Nicaraguans essentially became just another immigrant group in South Florida. Like Colombians, their settlement pattern lacked finality, with continuous back and forth movements to their home country. Some Nicaraguan ethnic organizations survived, but they were just a shadow of what they had been in the 1980s. By 2015, the census reported that there were still 114 Nicaraguans living in the Miami metro area, representing again almost 5% of its population. Politically and socially, they had become nearly invisible. A few busts of the national poet, Rubén Darío, still exist here and there, and San John Bosco Parish in East Little Havana rose to become the spiritual center of the former refugees. Yet, no single prominent Nicaraguan figure can be found in elite political circles today. Electorally, Nicaraguans who acquire U.S. citizenships have loyally supported Cuban candidates for office, a payback of sorts for the assistance and the support received in earlier decades from this group. Very quickly, approximately 22% of the Miami metropolitan population is composed of immigrants from elsewhere in Latin America, and that population is not homogeneous either, but it features at least three strands: refugees, professional and white-collar immigrants, and agriculture and other manual workers. The principal new source of would-be refugees at present is Venezuela, afflicted by yet another populist regime under the so-called Nicaraguan Revolution. Following a time-honored pattern, the upper and middle classes of that country have emigrated in large numbers to South Florida, just as the Cubans did earlier on, their principal area of destination being the Doral municipality in Miami. In 2015, the U.S. Census counted over 56,000 Venezuelans already living in this metropolitan area, and that number has surely increased in recent years. A second flow from Latin America is made of entrepreneurs and professionals who come to Miami to invest capital or pursue their careers. Much of that migration is actually preventive. That is, people transfer their capitals or themselves here as a calculated move against another possible populist uprising at home. As an Argentine businessman that we interviewed for my last project said, every morning when I open the newspaper, I give thanks to God that it's not going to say that the dollar has been devalued by 50%, that properties of the rich will be confiscated, or that taxes will be doubled. Miami is actually, in its relationship to Latin America, is not the city where the politically victorious come to claim their prize, but the place where those defeated by populist uprisings, or where those anticipating a similar fate come preventively. Out of these near desperate flows, this city by Biscayne Bay has built itself. Its ascent to global city status, where it is today, has been due to a large extent to the continuous political instability in its Latin background, yielding over time significant contributions coming here of capital, of entrepreneurial energy, and of talents. One just briefly, the last population that I want to mention, because it is important in the context of your overall study, as you go to other cities where the Hispanic population look very different from what I have described, are the Mexicans, Mexican and Central Americans. They are very similar to the flows coming to California and the Midwest and elsewhere. The economy of the southern quadrant of Dade County, centered around the towns of Homestead and Florida City, is agricultural, producing fruits and winter vegetables for export to the rest of the nation. If you go there, to Homestead or Florida City, the Latin flavor in that part of the county is very different from here. It's very different from downtown Miami. That flavor there, just a few miles away, is overwhelmingly Mexican. The fruit pickers and agricultural laborers in the region are mostly undocumented Mexican and Central American migrants. Mexican migrant workers are very seldom seen here in downtown Miami. Actually, a gulf separates the daily lives and future prospects of Cuban and South American immigrants and their children living in well-to-do neighborhoods like Coral Gable, Coconut Grove, and other affluent areas of the county, and those of Mexicans and Central Americans in Homestead. That gap also extends to Central Americans, Nicaraguans, and even to the most recently arrived Cuban refugees who settle in working-class areas of the city, such as Hialeah. Those migrants provide the core of the workforce for the hotels, the restaurants, the tourist attractions, and other service industries at the center of this metropolitan economy, but they seldom live near their workplaces. Instead, they must fight traffic congestion that gets worse and worse in this area, being actually an existential threat to its continued growth morning and night in order to going to and from their places of residence. Miami, in that sense, shares with other global cities like New York, London, Tokyo, the dubious distinction of being one of the most unequal places in the world. even today. The glittering skyline by Biscayne Bay that you can see as you step out of this building, and the line of condominium luxury buildings in Miami Beach contrast sharply with widespread and often desperate poverty to the west, north, and south of the county. Poverty and high crime affect not only Latin areas, but vast parts of the black population in Overtown, Liberty City, and Miami Gardens. The challenge, therefore, faced by Miami elites, some of whom we have the honor to have here in the audience, which now include, these elites now include a good number of Cuban American businessmen and professionals, as well as South American investors, is how to extend the benefits and wealth of a rapidly growing globalized economy to its most deprived sectors. At $30,375 per year, the city of Miami median household income is about $15,000 below the state of Florida. This means that all this glitter and all this accumulation is not enough to lift the average income of the population of the city above near poverty level. That Miami is such a poor city in the midst of glittering wealth reflects well the challenge to be overcome. City and county political and civil leaders are very well aware of these disparities. Hopefully, future years will witness effective action against this situation and its results for the city as a whole and for the majority of its population. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah. Okay. I also have a 20-minute presentation, but I'll cut back on the stylistic points and give you data, because I'm mostly driven by the data that we've been compiling in the Cuba poll, a project that I've been conducting since 1991. That has measured the state of the ideological profile of the Cuban American population in Miami, especially when it has to deal with Cuban American relations. U.S.-Cuba relations. So I'm going to drive through some of the data and then kind of contextualize it in the political shifts that have been going on in the population. And I do have a text, but I think I'll probably go without it. The main point is that if there was ever a statistically homogeneous Cuban-American population in Miami, it ceased to exist before 1991 when we started looking for it. In 1991, we actually started doing the Cuba poll and looking specifically to see the dimensions of political activity and profiles within the community. I'm going to present a lot of the data from 1997 to the present, to the last poll, 2016, and these are the different polls that we've done to give you an idea of what kind of data bank I'm drawing my conclusions from and my reports from. But we have, I'm pulling out variables from earlier polls as well, because it's the theme of what I want to, the takeaway that I want you to have here is that the Cuban American community has been changing from the very beginning and I came before all you guys, by the way, before you. And so we've been here, the Cuban American population has been here since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, 1959. And since that time, Cubans keep coming. And the Cubans from 1960s are not the same as the Cubans from 2000 and 2016. So that's kind of the dynamic that I'm driving home here. You'll see back in 1991, looking at the topic of unrestricted travel for all Americans, which is one of the questions we've asked consistently throughout the years, there was only a 45% support for unrestricted travel for all Americans, and then by the year 1997, you have even less support for that. You know, so you have to remember the context of 1991. The Soviet Union was disappearing. There was a sense that the next lechoncito is definitely going to be in Havana, and there was a softening of a lot of well-established hard lines. That became, that time passed, the puppet master died, but the puppet survived somehow, and the hard lines were retrenched. 1997 is an important year, and I'll bring it to your attention in a second. Even the question of the embargo, you'll see that in 1991, a whopping 87% of Cubans supported the embargo, maintaining the embargo. And it wasn't until 1997 that that number even went down below 80%. It's a 79%, 78%. So you have a very strong exilio histórico trajectory to attitudes towards U.S.-Cuban relations that started to change in 1997, 1995, when the new immigrants started coming over, thanks to the Immigration Agreement of 1995. Now, here's some other kind of interesting data. In pleno periodo especial, right, in the middle of the special period in Cuba, in the 1990s, when medicine and when Cubans actually were facing a great deal of hardship in terms of nutrition, et cetera, we were not very sympathetic. There was an opposition to selling food. From only 23% of the population of Miami in 1993 supported selling food to Cuba. That went up to 41% in 1997, but still, even food was not something that you could consider softening your hardline stance in order to help the Cuban people at a point when they really needed the help. So the point is that there was a hard line, or there was a core to the exile ideology before this new immigration started in 1995 that has since shifted. And there you can see the beginning of the upward climb of more conciliatory, engagement-prone policies. You have in 1997 selling food and medicine, the medicine in red, the food in blue. You can see the increase in supporting that kind of exchange with the island. In the year 2000, it became legal in the United States to sell agricultural products to the island, and that was supported by the population. So you can see a shift in the population, and that is the demographic transition that is fueling the ideological transition in the population. The new arrivals think differently about Cuba than the pre-1995 cohorts. The issue of travel, the same way. You can see from 1997, they started off about the same place. Almost 45% of Cuban Americans have traveled to Cuba by 2016, and 75% support opening up travel to the island by 2016. And you can see the base of less than a quarter to more than half, almost. The embargo on diplomatic relations. We had a blip there in the year 2000, the Ileana Fair. We went out and interviewed people as to what relations should be. And Ileana, although it hardened some positions, it softened the position of wanting to have some dialogue, at least at the diplomatic level with Cuba. But you can see there, on the thorny question of the embargo, which is the blue line, in 2016, 63% of Cuban Americans want to remove the embargo. And you can, but it started way back down in 22%, so only 22% supported the abolition of the embargo in 1997. So you can see the increase, the transition within the community as well as with diplomatic relations. 69% of Cuban Americans today believe that there should be diplomatic relations with the island. Now, on political lag, I guess after so many years in studying the Cuban American population, it is a valid question to ask why all of these changes in attitudes have not been reflected more broadly in the narrative about Cubans, because we still think of the population as being very homogeneous. and more specifically in the political arena. Certainly none of our representatives in Washington can be categorized as dialogueros, to use the now almost forgotten term that divided the community decades back. They are instead very committed to appealing out of conviction or opportunism to the isolationist angels still living inside our battered body politics. Still, their longevity cannot be denied. Representative Ros-Lehtinen has served in Congress for 29 years come this year when she steps down. She's the longest serving congressional representative in Florida. Mario Diaz-Balart has served since 2003, which is precisely the period that begins the documented dramatic transition in our community. Marco Rubio and Carlos Curbelo are more recent arrivals, but have shown little inclination to reevaluate their position on Cuba, which remains the position of the exilio histórico, even while the winds of change sweep through their Cuban constituents. To be sure, part of the staying power of our representatives is due to the structural basis of the electoral system, which favors incumbents, regardless of their party. Equally as significant is the fact that Cubans are not one-issue voters. As important as U.S.-Cuba relations are to the Cuban population, when that's the topic of discussion, as it is in my poll, when asked to rank the most important issues facing the community, other polls have shown that Cubans place U.S.-Cuba policy about the same place where other Latinos place foreign policy, about fourth or fifth in the priority list. Issues such as healthcare, jobs and economy, education, crime, even immigration often rank higher among what's important for the Cuban American population. And certainly it would be a huge mistake probably to assume that the decline in Republican registrations in the Cuban American populations is a response to the party's position on Cuba. Until Obama's game-changing moves, there was scant evidence that the Democrats were any better on the issue. It's more likely that the increase in independents and Democratic registrants is due to other concerns, such as GOP's attack on health care, Medicare, and Medicaid, as well as the rise of more liberal second and third generation of Cuban Americans. We do know, for example, that the old Cuban, the Cuban old guard is a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act. Another element influencing the disconnect between attitudes and political representation is the low voter registration that we find among the new arriving Cuban Americans. Most Cubans who are citizens do register to vote, but the number of citizens among new arrivals is lower than previous cohorts. About 70%, as you can see here, of the arrivals from 1995 to 2009, so those that were eligible to become citizens by the time we did the poll in 2016, only 70% had by that time become citizens. Now, if you look at that, and then you look at of the citizens, 84% of the arrivals from 1995 to 2016 were registered to vote. But if you combine the number of citizens, of non-citizens, with the folks that are not registered to vote, you have 45% of the newly arrived since 1995 that are standing in the sidelines looking in our political process. They're either not citizens or not registered. You have 40% of that population that is not engaged in our political process. The data suggests, as these voter registration data shows from our poll, data suggests that once these new arrivals get involved, we will be likely to see a shift in the political landscape. New arrivals that do register to vote do so as independents, 43%, or Democrats, 31%. Now, a word on the most recent performance of those Cuban Americans who could vote in the November 2016 elections. After the Trump victory, Cuban Republicans immediately proclaimed that Trump owed his win in Florida to the Cuban vote, and that the vote was in fact a referendum on Obama's engagement policies towards Cuba. I don't want to relive that fight or lose that battle again, But in order to emphasize how the Cubans are changing, the Cuban population is changing in Miami, let me point out some details that have been gathered by others. Many analysts have looked at the voting patterns in Florida, and there's a solid consensus that the main reason Trump pulled off a 113,000 vote victory over Clinton was his outstanding performance in the 41 non-Hispanic white counties in the center of the state, a performance that eclipsed any Republican since 2000. In fact, had Hillary mirrored Obama's performance among non-Hispanic whites in Florida, she would have netted an additional 349,000 votes, well above what she needed to win. Meanwhile, I'm going to go into this a little bit more detail in the next slide, but the Pew Research Center, using data from the National Election Pool, it concluded that about half of the Cuban Americans in Florida went for Trump. By my calculations, that's about right. So let's break it down. The Cuban American voters accounted for approximately 6%, that's 564,938 votes cast in the Florida elections this past in 2016. Let's be conservative and say that Hillary got 44% of those votes. Trump won by 113,000 votes. If Hillary got 44% of the Cubans' 500 and some thousand votes, that would give her 248,000 votes. Okay, let's go crazy, and that second line down there, and let's go crazy and say she won 10% more, 54% of the vote. That would give her an additional 62,000 votes. Still not enough to catch Trump's victory margin of 113,000 votes. We might as well give credit to Gary Johnson, who received 207,000 votes, and have him take credit for the Trump win. Now, as 538 pointed out, Cuban Americans would have needed to vote for Hillary by an impossibly wide margin to swing the election her way, not close to 113,000. What was the quote? The election her way, and Trump would have won the state even if they had not voted at all. Now, we do know some things just pulling out the raw data from the voting precincts of Hialeah, Westchester, and West Miami. And we do know that the Democrats made inroads in the majority Cuban and traditionally Republican cities that I just mentioned. Obama's 2012 vote totaled, I should say Clinton surpassed Obama's 2012 vote by 5,950 votes in Hialeah and lost to Trump only by 93 votes. In addition, Democrats saw a 14-point improvement in Westchester, the community with one of the highest percentage of residents born in Cuba in the United States. And I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but Clinton did not crash and burn among Cuban Americans as much as we think she might have. Now, even in this victory, the question I have is, was this also a referendum on Obama policies? Well, let's go through it real quickly. In the Cuba poll, we conducted the Cuba poll 2 months right before the election. In that, 2 months before the 2016 elections, we see that there was over 64% of the population of Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County supported the new policies initiated by the U.S. government towards Cuba, hacia Cuba. We had a split in the population towards Clinton and Trump, with a percentage, Trump coming in higher than Clinton as expected. Now, looking specifically at the supporters of the new policies, the Trump voters, 41% of the Trump voters supported the new policies. So yes, Trump voters did not support the opening as much as the Clinton voters, but 41% did. So that is a substantial number in when you're thinking about U.S.-Cuba relations and keeping the Cuban population as a non-monolithic block in your mind. Now, on the embargo, which is always the hard question, do you want to get rid of the embargo? Sure enough, Trump voters were less sympathetic to relieving removing the embargo. 63% supported continuing the embargo, completely opposite from the Clinton supporters. But 37% of Trump voters did think that we should remove the embargo. So as far as the Obama policies goes and them aligning with the vote of Trump-Clinton, they do, but not as monolithically, again, as we might think. So yes, there is a transition occurring. It is glacially slow, but certainly it will reshape the social political landscape in time. The changes in attitudes that have occurred do matter. I mean, speaking personally now, and for my conclusion, even if all the voters had voted for Trump, the changes that have occurred in this community during the last 30 years have made a profound difference in the daily lives of individual Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County and in the political culture of Miami-Dade County. It's not your mother's exile anymore. Cubans don't have to whisper behind closed doors that they are visiting friends or relatives on the island for fear of repercussion, negative repercussions and persecution, which was the case. The violence and threats which characterized the intransigence response to engagement during the 70s, 80s, and the beginning of the 90s have disappeared. And while being called a communist because of holding vaguely liberal attitudes is still a possibility outside of Versailles in any given day, its negative repercussions have diminished. After all, many of our children would fall into that category today. Now, continuing on and concluding on a personal note, I conduct my research, and people that know me, I have a couple of colleagues in the audience, they know that I am compulsively, methodologically driven with the rigor and objectivity that I hope to attain in some ideal world, but I am not neutral, personally. I am not neutral. I do hope for normal relations with Cuba. The changes that we have objectively documented in the Cuba poll, we hopefully signal what Julio Antonio Maya said, todo tiempo futuro tiene que ser mejor, all future times will be better. But no doubt, those of us who hope for more engagement, which was the attitude of the minority of the community until very recently, we have a tough road to hoe in our current political climate. In my opinion, we're going through a type of periodo especial ourselves, a special period. We're not lacking food or luxuries, but we're lacking imagination. This is a special period characterized by, I believe, by the poverty of the exile imagination. We're living in historic and hysteric times, the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, the end of many of the policies put in place during the Cold War era to punish a small country allied with an enemy that no longer exists, the implementation of changes on the island which are certain to increase the hope for more changes in the population of the island. And you know, you can't unring the bell of hope. The death of Fidel, the emergence of a true transnational and expat community of Cubans in the United States that can travel freely back and forth. History is handing us on a plate the opportunity to unite around the goal of really contributing to the changing world that Cubans live here and there. But the best that our political leaders can come up with in this historic times is to demand a return to failed policies, demand a toughening of the punitive isolationist positions of the U.S. towards Cuba, positions which have fueled bitterness and resentment and fear on both sides of the Florida Strait for so long, and I think, as they say, we're better than that. But I know that to make Maya's world a reality, we have to follow the advice of another activist, this time a labor activist born in Sweden, one of those countries, you know, who gave his life in the United States to improve the life of the working people in the United States, a struggle which we are still fighting for today. And so I close with the words and advice of Joe Hill, which ring true in today's world to me, and I hope that they do to you. Don't mourn, organize. That's it.
For questions. So what I'd like to do is just get several questions, and then I'll let each of our panelists address whichever ones that they want to, but I want to at least give a few people a chance to ask some questions. So are there any questions from the audience? We have some over here, so let's get those out on the table for our panelists, and then we can answer them together.
Hello. So I have a very basic question. I noticed that the title is The Future of Latinos in the United States, but then later it's the Miami Leadership Summit on the Future of Hispanics. Is there a difference or importance between Latino and Hispanic, and how does that play out in a place like Miami?
Next question, and then we'll answer them all together.
Good morning. Yeah, just a question about the poll. What was the sample? How many people did you interview or get in touch with to get the...
Yeah, I have a lot of methodology. which I
Just to have
cannot
an
do.
idea of the number.
The samples are usually,
Let them do it, and then they'll...
well, this is a
just
quick
let's get
answer, though. Okay, so,
Okay,
yeah.
let's just let the, and then we'll let everybody have a chance.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'd like to ask if, other than the policy issue of Cuba, what other issues did you investigate that are important to the community, the Latino community, and what age groups, how did that differentiate among age groups, those policies, how people thought about those policies? Thank you.
And then we had one more question, I think, in the back, is that right? And then has to be the last one, and then we'll let everybody speak to the issues that are raised. Is this gentleman, I thought in the blue shirt.
Just a couple of comments I would like your reaction to. Alejandro, I've always admired your work, but I disagree with you about Colombians. I think Colombians are now got elected to the state senate. Annette Tadeo, another one, state legislature. There is real activity and real energy in that community. There was a Colombian candidate for county mayor, which was which ran as basically a nuisance candidate, but got 6% of the vote with very little money, basically running on an anti-Cuban coalition, right? It was very interesting. So I would not discount the Colombians as you did. And second, Guillermo, I think the most interesting, which kind of captures the division of the Cuban-American community, and I think Cubans are suffering from xenophobic on the embargo and on relations with Cuba. And that is that Miami-Dade County went for Hillary by an astounding, historic, higher than Obama in 12 by 275,000 votes. But Marco Rubio only lost Dade County by 99,000 votes. So 175,000 people in Dade County voted for Hillary and voted for Marco. And I think that captures the schizophrenia in the Cuban community.
Okay, great. So I'm going to let each of you, and then we'll wrap up.
That is, Hispanic or Latino usually are used as synonymous. Basically, we consider those somewhat problematic labels. They are labels of convenience, but both of them, as I pointed out, bring together populations that are very, very different. Under the label, you have people who were born whose ancestors were in the country for generations, and people who arrived yesterday. You have people who are from very different classes. You have people who are phenotypically white, mulatto, mestizo, black. So it is not that Latinos cannot be equated, say, with African Americans as a homogeneous, any ethnic group with a common history and so on. And so when you speak of Hispanics in Miami, as we're doing now we have to be very careful as this forum moves elsewhere. It's not the same. It's not the same history. It's not the same. Miami has a very unique history, as we both have mentioned, and it's actually exceptional in the majority of the population, because if anything, the bulk of the so-called Hispanic population are Mexicans and their descendants. That's the the locomotives that drive the Hispanic train. About 60% of the population are Mexican or Mexican Americans, which in this county represents a minority. And now going to the last question, I think that that's probably, I know Aneta, she was repeatedly defeated in earlier campaigns precisely because of being Colombian and not being able, and even hitching up. It's a wonderful thing that she got elected finally as the Senator State to the Florida Senate, and that may be a harbinger of things to come. I don't know, because I don't know anybody else, but it's high time, I think, that other groups in the community, especially Colombians who have been here, have a greater participation. What I have analyzed in no uncertain terms is what has happened up to now. And now we'll see that is if in the future we have a different participation. And of course, I think Guillermo is going to refer to this. The polls show very clearly this bifurcation of the Cuban community between the old-timers, the people who came in the 60s and 70s, and perhaps part of their children, and what had come before. And interestingly, a large proportion of the more recently arrived Cuban population, as his own data show, behave like immigrants have always behaved, and like Nicaraguans, and so namely, they come, work hard, and send remittances home, and then travel back. That's exactly what Mexicans, Nicaraguans, that's a typical immigrant pattern. What was unusual was the behavior of the earlier waves of Cuban exiles, precisely because of the blockage and the opposition to the regime, that as a typical Cuban exile of the 60s and 70s would say, and they would say, I don't travel to Cuba because that would be dishonoring my family, and I don't contribute a single dollar to Castro. Have you heard that before? Well, that was the view, that was a common view, and that it was the view of my relatives and so on. And definitely, I wanted to point one more thing. It is changing, but the interesting thing is it's changing at the polls. So people, when they go to vote, they exercise their right to do that, but it's not changing in terms of public voice in the media and so on. Still, that is the general view is that Cuban American community is monolithic, and it is led by the people who always led it. But I think that what Guillermo's data show is that when people silently go into the voting booth, they are not behaving the same way as they used to.
Quick answers. The poll, we try to peg it around 1,000 sample, random sample, 50% landmines, 50% landmines. Yeah, that's what the poll is. Landlines and cell lines. So yeah, so that's the first slide up there showed the different samples over the years. The question on other policies, we don't measure other policies unless they are currently, when we take the poll, front burner stuff. So Elian, we had questions on Elian. Other polls do show that Cubans are more interested in healthcare, for example, than Cuban-American relations. I mean, than U.S.-Cuban relations in many ways. So I would say that we don't measure it in our polls. I can't tell you directly. In terms of age groups, we ask age, and then we can categorize them any way we want. We find that the most telling variable, the most independent of variables is arrival time, when you've arrived from the island. And then generational differences. So the younger Cubans are, whether they've arrived or have been born here, younger Cuban Americans are more liberal, less likely to hold the views of my mother and folks like us that we came in the early 60s that are more hardline towards Cuba. The younger you are, and the more recently arrived, you hold different relations with the island that you knew differently than as a revolutionary experiment. And I think that's it. That's all I got.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your being here and look forward to the next panel, which will be in this room.
Thank you.